Hey everybody, welcome to the Blendr Report, where news meets rational thinking. I'm your host, Jonathan Harvey, and this is your co-host, Liam DeBoer. Liam, what's up, bro?
Not too much, brother. Today we're going to be chatting about Edmonton announcing it will become a 15-minute city, a look behind the narrative, what climate science actually says, a right-wing wave expected across multiple EU elections, NDP, Green Party, and a Trudeau-appointed senator pushing to change the voting age to 16, Polievre promising to repeal all of Trudeau's egregious gun laws, a study debunking the government's claim that poverty is tied to systemic racism, and Fauci admitting he did not follow the science in Big Pharma's secret payments to NIH reaching over $700 million. However, if before we get into things, you wouldn't mind leaving us a kind review on Spotify, or subscribing to our YouTube channel wherever you're watching, that would be greatly appreciated. All right, let's get started. All right, so first off, we've got Edmonton announcing it will become a 15-minute city. 15-minute cities are coming to Edmonton, with City Councillor Andrew Knack praising the concept, stating, quote, "You won't need a car." The City Council is advancing plans to make Edmonton a 15-minute city where all necessities are within a 15-minute walk. However, many residents oppose the plan, fearing limited vehicle spaces and fines for leaving their district. Councillor Karen Tang addressed concerns, attributing opposition to conspiracy theories. Knack, active on social media, emphasizes the convenience of not needing a car, despite skepticism from some citizens about practicality during harsh winters. The World Economic Forum supports reducing car dependence, aligning with Edmonton's initiative. So, would you agree with the statement that today's conspiracy is tomorrow's reality?
Yeah, I mean, it's hard not to, right? I mean, you look at just what's happened over the last 5 years, and of course you have these 15-minute cities, which is kind of preposterous. They're saying, it's on conspiracy theorists. That's just got a bad name, except they implemented the conspiracy. So I'm like, all right, cool. You also have CBDCs. This is something that people said was not going to happen, that they would not be used. And we know what they can do. We saw what they did kind of through the pandemic with the Freedom Convoy and stuff. We know they'll freeze your bank accounts. So you're basically just making this easier for them. They'll be able to track all your transactions, do all this stuff. So that was a conspiracy. Except now over 130 countries are not only exploring them, they're starting to apply them, right? So that's sort of dead in the water. Digital IDs, this whole thing about, not needing to use these things and they wouldn't be mandatory. And you're seeing it on Ontario government websites now. And they're implementing these things again at scale across the world in Western governments. And now they're not only doing them nationally, they're doing them globally. They want to have they want to have everything connected. And again, I'm sure like people can say, well, it's convenience. It's like, well, we couldn't travel through the pandemic if you didn't get a vaccination. And this information will be on your digital identification and will be shared with other countries. This is a huge problem. Again, conspiracy, reality. COVID lab leak theory. That's a fun one. Pretty much every organization in the world that's got any credibility is like, yeah, no, it came from a lab. Even what's his name? Was it Brett or Eric Weinstein? Brett. He's the evolutionary biologist. Mm-hmm. Yeah, he's like, I don't exactly remember the numbers, so someone will have to double check this. But he basically said, look, if you find a virus and it's got one thing that doesn't look like it was in nature, okay, novel. This happens. But there were like 7 to 10 different markers in this virus that identified it as a man-made virus because none of those characteristics were found in nature. So we know it came out of a lab, except if you said anything about that, not only were you made into a pariah, you were ostracized, you were called racist. I'm like, what the fuck are we doing here? But again, now they pretty much admit it. Even Fauci the other day under oath is kind of like, yeah, that's a reasonable idea. It might have happened. Like, what? Okay, great. Another interesting one that I was looking up was the Pegasus Project. So this happened in July of 2021, and this was surveilling journalists. So the Pegasus Project was an investigation conducted by basically a consortium of media organizations coordinated by Forbidden Stories, which is an organization, and supported by Amnesty International. They revealed that Pegasus spyware, so if you're not familiar, Pegasus is basically software that can, I don't know who created it, probably the CIA.
It was Israel.
Oh, perfect. Oh, yeah, the NOS or something like that. Yeah. So they created this technology that they can just weaponize against you and have access to your entire phone. And I remember Pegasus 1, you had to open something. You had to like open a message or something so they can infiltrate. Pegasus 2, they just have to know your phone number. Like you're totally fucked. So this ended up being true. It was being used by various governments to target and surveil journalists, activists, politicians, and business executives. So look, yeah, pretty much. I know it sounds a little crazy, but I feel like a large majority of the conspiracies that have a reasonable amount of credibility are coming true, right?
And it seems to me that the 4 stages of media manipulation, somebody pointed this out really well, is that first they will gaslight you. So they'll say, that's not true and it's definitely not happening. And then they'll dismiss. So they'll say, yes, it's happening, but it's no big deal. Then they'll cope and say, okay, it's actually good that it's happening and here's why. And then last, they'll attack and say that the people who don't like what is happening are the real problem. That seems to be the playbook here for every single one of those conspiracies. Yeah, somebody pointed that out on Twitter, and I think that is spot on. Back to the whole 15-minute city thing here as well. In like cars, it's hard not to realize that they are the epitome of individual liberty. And I think Peterson actually has pointed this out quite a few times.
I think there's 2 marks of tyranny right now. People who hate comedians, people who hate automobiles.
Right.
Really, it's like, man, that's a line of war for me. It's like,
Really?
keep your hands off my fucking car.
Yeah, right.
Prick.
Uh-huh.
Yeah. Well, you think about what a car stands for. It's like radical autonomy and privacy, right?
Right.
And that's the problem too with the centralized control systems on cars now. You know, we'll help you out with your OnStar. It's like, yeah, you'll govern where I can drive. You'll govern how fast I can drive. You'll end up bloody well reporting me if I exceed 55 and destroy the planet. No, I really don't like those centralized control systems at all. I think they're a big mistake because as soon as they're put in, it's like those centralized control systems for people's home heating. It's like, well, we'll help you save on your bill until
you're
you
looking
can't use
further
your
down
heat.
the road of where they're going with it. Like, so for example, when social media started, it was the place to upload pictures.
Yeah.
But now it's a way to try and influence how we feel about things.
Sure. Well, it's the same with digital currency. It's like, we'll make a national digital currency, and then we'll tax everything that you purchase that we think has a carbon load.
Mm-hmm.
And that's, you can just bloody well be sure that the behind the scenes globalists are just rubbing their hands about that.
You see what happened in California recently?
No.
So they've got a law. So first of all, in 2026, all vehicles made have to have a shutoff in America. That was a Biden initiative. Now by 2028, all vehicles in California that are speeding, this is working its way through. I imagine it will go through. If you're speeding, your car will beep at you, like as if you're not wearing your seatbelt.
Oh, okay, I did
which
see
is
that.
wild. And if you think about that, the only way to employ that strategy is if you know where I am every moment. Otherwise, you wouldn't know the speed limit.
They've also got that technology going in as well, where if your eyes are like, if it looks like you're drunk or sleepy, then your car will do the same sort of
That's
thing.
in Canada too.
What's funny is I can't remember if I sent it to you or not, but I found a video of an Asian guy driving in a car and it kept beeping at him, and he's like, "These things are fucking racist." But yeah, no, dude, it's absolutely insane. And again, when it comes to Canada, all of these policies they're putting in place to quote unquote save us from climate change, they don't make sense in Canada when, okay, you've got the solar panel issue, which like even just recently there was like a 4-week period where the sun didn't shine in Toronto. And then also on top of that, you've got like 5-month-long winters where solar panels are going to be covered in snow.
And you also only get like 7-8 hours of sunlight, even if you do have a good day.
Yeah. And then on top of with the car situation as well, like, okay, a 65-year-old, 70-year-old, you expect them to walk 15 minutes to the grocery store in, January, February weather
Totally
in order to get the groceries. Like, you can go fuck yourself.
Yeah.
Like it's absolutely insane. And I think, I've stated these figures on the podcast before, but I think like I really want them to just be drilled home is with these C40 initiatives. They've stated, and the C40 initiatives are the 15-minute cities, which Edmonton, Toronto, and Montreal are all already stated as going to be a part of. They say, zero private car ownership is the goal by 2030, 0 kilograms of meat consumption, 3 items of clothing per person per year, and then also limiting people to 1 short haul flight every 3 years. So like these initiatives, that's where they end up planning to go. And again, that's not coming from conspiracy theorists speculating about what might happen. This is directly in their C40 initiatives, which you can find on their website.
I keep saying this, and I don't know why, but I have to. I feel like they're going to run into roadblocks. So if you think about the 15-minute cities in Edmonton, Toronto, Montreal, they're kind of already set up that way in a lot of cases. So it's almost like that is the way that society sort of built itself, just out of the need for convenience, especially in a densely populated city. So Edmonton, I guess, probably has, I don't know how many people are in Edmonton, but 700,000 to 1 million, that range. Montreal, obviously Toronto's the biggest city. So you look at how these things are built already. It's like you kind of just have to put up a fence, like metaphorical. You don't really put up a fence. You kind of just go, okay, that's a 15-minute city. That's a 15-minute city. That over there. Cool. So, you can have several 15-minute cities within Toronto just by drawing imaginary lines, right? So you can kind of already do that. But when you get into the other things, when you get into things like trying to make a 15-minute city out of, I don't know, anywhere between Toronto and Orillia, say where my parents are from. When you look at that, like, okay, you've got Barrie, that's pretty sprawled out. It's 196 square kilometers. About 200 square kilometers. So you're not going to make that into a 15-minute city. How are you going to make that work? So when you don't have the dense population, how do you actually apply these principles? Which makes me believe that you can't really do this at scale. You can test it out right now, but unless you do something incredibly egregious and start forcing people into areas like basically camps, I don't see how they do this beyond the big cities. And in addition to that, limiting mileage. Like, how are you going to tell airlines you can't let people fly? Like, I know they can start taxing things, but again, that's going to be a tough one to apply. Like you said, with the older people, I don't know how they do it to this generation. How do you tell old people they can't go anywhere and can't get anything? What do you think is going to happen? It's like they can only go so far until there's a certain amount of revolt. Like, again, with the clothing thing, only 3 pieces of clothing. Well, I just buy it online. Fuck are you going to do about it? You know what I mean? Like, you're going to tell Amazon they're not going to sell me clothes. So, I mean, it's kind of one of those things where you see the initiatives and you see the intention, but I really think they're going to start running into some major roadblocks because they're just not easy to apply. You know what I mean?
Yeah, no, I agree that I think these things are impossible to implement, but at the same time, I don't think that means it'll stop them from trying.
I agree with you.
Yeah.
I totally agree with you. I guess it's like maybe a silver lining or something to look forward to is like, hey, they have had a pretty easy time implementing these rules since COVID happened, and that was their catalyst. And the 15-minute city thing, like I said, kind of just drawing imaginary lines. But when you get into some of those other initiatives, it's going to get pretty nasty because people are going to have to decide, are these people my overlords? Because that's what that looks like at that point. Because right now you have the illusion of say free will or a democracy, right? But if you're now telling me I can't eat meat, I can't leave this city, I can't buy clothing, I can't drive a car, I can't. When you start doing that, I start going, who the fuck am I punching out first? That's right. Because then it's like you are taking away my freedom and my free will and sort of the illusion of democracy. You're taking it away, right? And I just don't think they're going to be able to convince enough people that climate change is the reason I can't put clothes on my back. Like, get fucked. You know what I mean? So we'll see. We'll see how it goes.
Well, that leads us into the whole climate change narrative. So our second story for the day is a look behind the narrative, what climate science actually says. Climate alarmists such as former Vice President Al Gore and UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres have been warning of impending doom for decades, citing catastrophic impacts like ocean heating and ecosystem collapse. However, Nobel Prize winner John Clauser and physicist Stephen Koonin challenged this alarmist narrative, labeling it as a dangerous corruption of science. Koonin's book, Unsettled, critiques the sensationalism in media portrayals of climate science. He highlights how the IPCC, despite its bias and funding influences, still reports quote-unquote low confidence, which means a 0 to 10% probability in increased extreme weather events such as extratropical cyclones, droughts, and floods. Critics argue that climate models are unreliable and that stringent policies could harm economies and developing nations without significantly affecting global temperatures. So should we listen to these quote-unquote experts' warnings of climate change after seeing the blatant authoritarian use of trusting the science during the pandemic?
No, obviously we shouldn't. I mean, my big issue here is that they are applying this sort of faulty science to the economy and to country and to policy and how we have to live. For me, this is a big problem, right? I use Canada as an example because this is where we live, and I think this is important. They say that our carbon emissions are 1.5% of the world's like total emissions annually. Now, based on our math and based on understanding how many trees we have and the carbon capture, we are arguably 10 times below net zero, 10 times already. No one's admitting that. No one's having a conversation about it. It's wild. Anyway, the whole thing for me, like that whole initiative is a very, very broken narrative. The fact that they had no agreed upon way of measuring 1.5 degree increase in temperature, literally no way. Since the Paris Agreement, even this was like last year, they had no unified strategy. I'm like, what the fuck are we talking about? Anyway, when you apply it to Canada, though, you go, okay, well, you all need to suffer. You can't have this, that, or the other. And we need to do all these things and green energy and blah, blah, blah. And I'm for renewable energy and I'm for saving the planet. I am. But even if Canada does the best job possible, we still only emit 1.5%. So even if we did reduce that to zero, the rest of China, India, those other places are going to make up for it. Don't worry. But our entire economy, our country is in shambles because we don't have cheap energy. Everything's a mess here. So I don't think we should listen to them. And I think it's even more important to separate the climate alarmism from politics right now.
And to me, it's the issue of the impossibility of tracking these things properly. So you can look at climate much like human diet and human nutrition and weight loss, where you can't just do one factor and then try to measure the differences. So let's say with climate, for instance, they put all of their eggs in the basket of CO2. And hey, I am sure that CO2 plays some sort of factor in everything, but I think it's also safe to say that there is other natural cycles at play here as well. And going to that, say, diet analogy, like cutting back on CO2 would be kind of similar to, actually, and Steve Koonin uses this example in his book, where it'd be like adding a cucumber to somebody's diet and then tracking their weight gain or weight loss over 3 months and trying to say that it's whether they were ingesting that cucumber or not made the difference. And it's like, no, also their lifestyle plays a factor. What other foods were they taking in? What's their environment like? What's their base metabolic rate? All of this, there's unending number of factors which play into your question of, is this thing that I added in or took out causing the changes in the system? But then too, he also, and I would highly suggest checking out his book, Unsettled. It was one of the ones that very much opened my eyes about this whole thing. And yeah, we can link the Unsettled book down in the description below for anybody that wants to check out that book. And I think it's important to note that all of their predictions for the future of climate change are based on computer-generated models. So they're called the Coupled Model Intercomparison Project, otherwise known as CMIPs. It's CMIP3, the first version, ensemble, informed the IPCC's AR4 report, while the CMIP5 underpinned the 2013 AR's report, and CMIP6 was the basis for the upcoming AR6 assessment. But Steve Koonin says that this is where we need to take a pause. Comparisons among models within any of these ensembles show that on the scales required to measure the climate's response to human influences, model results differ dramatically both from each other and from observations. But you wouldn't know that unless you read deep into the IPCC report. Only then would you discover that the results being presented are quote-unquote averaging models that disagree widely with one another. One particularly jarring failure is that the simulated global average surface temperature varies among models by about 3 degrees Celsius, 3 times greater than the observed value of the 20th century warming they're purporting to describe and explain. So each one of these models gives out a different answer, and then they take those differing, assuming wrong answers, or at least only one of them in the best case scenario could be correct, and then they add them all into a bundle, they average it out and say, this is what the future looks like. And then another problem is that the spread of the CMIP's ensemble in the years after 1960 is larger than that of the models in CMIP3. In other words, the later generation of models is actually more uncertain than the earlier ones. So here's a real surprise. Even as the models become more sophisticated, the uncertainty increased rather than decreased. And the report also explicitly states, in general, that the CMIP model ensembles, quote, cannot be taken as a reliable regional probability forecast for any aspect of the climate, In other words, the models are even worse at describing changes in regional climates than they are at describing changes in global quantities. So, like, this is just sham science from top to bottom.
Why don't they take a report from any one of those moments in time where they said this is the information and then reference it to the near future? Why don't they just go, hey, look, in 2013, they said this and this and this were going to happen over 10 years. Well, none of this happened. And just to sort of highlight that this is so faulty, I'm surprised. Maybe he's doing it in his book and maybe more people are doing it. I'm just not catching it. But you think that would be a pretty easy way to discredit this system and what they're doing? Because obviously it's a sensationalizing program, right?
And two, like the headlines that end up in media outlets, you know, it's so funny. Like you'll see things being like claims being made about the certainty of human influences causing things like weather events and all of this. But then, yes, you go and look actually in the report and they state low confidence, which is, yes, a 0 to 10% probability. And
literally zero. That's so significant that we're sold so much shit. And there's a percent, it's possible that there's a 0% chance we are contributing to it in any way with the extreme weather.
Yeah.
Wild.
And so all throughout his book, he gives different examples of being like, here's the reporter cites that they're taking this information from this report, but here's what it was actually said in full context. And a lot of the times in the actual report, in the actual quote unquote, the science, it says like, yeah, we're very uncertain about this. We can't be entirely sure. But then, of course, what gets printed in media is like, we're entirely sure about this.
That's wild. And there's no accountability there.
And now we've also got Canadian MPs wanting ecocide perpetrators prosecuted by the International Criminal Court. They are advocating for the acknowledgement of ecocide as a crime by the ICC for international prosecution. And they held a press conference in Ottawa to discuss the urgent need for legal measures against mass environmental destruction, citing ongoing climate-related disasters like wildfires as evidence of the inadequacy of current legislation. The ICC currently prosecutes crimes like genocide, war crimes, crimes against humanity, and crimes of aggression, but does not include ecocide. Advocates argue that criminalizing ecocide would hold powerful individuals accountable and change decision-making dynamics regarding environmental destruction. They have launched a petition to add ecocide to the Rome Statute of the ICC. So again, the Rome Statute is one of these things where any of the countries that are partnered with the ICC, they essentially give them the right to prosecute for certain crimes within their nations. And, you know, we've talked about on this podcast before that the whole play here on the global stage, this globalism push by the World Economic Forum and the United Nations through Agenda 2030 is to cede sovereignty within our nations to larger global bodies like the UN, like the WHO, like the ICC, which all undermine actual sovereignty of our nations. And I think this is just another example of them pushing for that because, again, okay, they cite the wildfires as evidence for why these things are needed. Again, we've already seen this year every single wildfire in Alberta has been human caused. It's, you know, it's arson, arson or just negligence.
Yeah, it could be one. But it could be campfire.
But my point here is, so they say like, okay, the International Criminal Court should be able to charge people like that. Well, you already have the legal means within Canada in order to charge people for those. So like, again, there's no need for this higher body other than if the goal is just to give our sovereignty away.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. Like, what's interesting about the ecocide thing is I don't really have a big problem with holding people accountable for mass damage or destruction of nature. I don't have an issue with that. I think that that's actually a pretty important thing to have in place. But like you said, we already have laws that cover those things. Ceding power to a global government doesn't really help. It doesn't really make it any better. The other concern I have is when they do things like this is it's a broad term. It's a broad term and you don't know how they're going to weaponize it. But one thing we've come to learn is give them an inch, they take a mile. So like you said, there's already adequate rules in place and there's already sort of adequate legal process in place to manage these situations. So the only thing that I can think is, other than there's being some political talking point for the Green Party because no one gives a fuck about them, the only thing I can think is that they're doing this for that exact purpose, to cede more power to global governments and for this to expand to what? Because Ecocide right now could be a large corporation dumping nuclear waste into a lake. I know that's very Simpson, but you know what I mean. So that I understand, but what they're going to make this mean in the future because of their faulty climate science might get very dangerous. Now, you driving a gas-powered car could be Ecocide. So this gets out of hand pretty quickly, right?
100%. All right, moving on to our third story for the day. We've got a right-wing wave expected across multiple EU elections. Right-wing parties are surging in European polls, especially in France, Belgium, Poland, Austria, Italy, Germany, Spain, and Netherlands, amongst others. Of course, it's challenging to pinpoint the exact outcomes, but if the predicted trends hold true, Europe will be facing significant changes in the coming year. So do you think the support for right-wing parties will continue to grow in Canada, America, and Europe?
Yeah, I mean, I'm of the opinion the pendulum is already swinging. And if the elections aren't already significantly captured, and there's just sort of a shred of democracy left, I believe there will be a massive conservative wave, right? And look, it's not really about it being conservative or Democrat in the traditional sense. It signifies change. That's what's more important. People don't like where the world is going. People don't like what the elites, whether they're corporate or political elites, are doing. People are like, well, we need to cede more power to these people. It's like, but no, you guys had all the power. You fucked everything up. So that's what I think this signifies more than anything. And that's why I talk about, elections being captured in democracy, because they'll tell you that, anybody voting for Republican or conservative right now, it's a vote against democracy. It's like, look, having a vote means democracy. And I'm of the opinion that this is just a big push back against a very, very broken world right now. But what I think is going to be interesting to watch specifically in Europe is that you're seeing a big rise in right-wing policy and right-wing politicians. But that fights directly against the European Union, which is currently this sort of authoritarian left-leaning group of people that are now kind of overlords in Europe. So it's going to be a really interesting battleground because the two are connected, right? Obviously, whoever's getting elected in the nations are then a part of the EU. And it's a bit of a different system there because they're kind of elected within the group. But I think it's going to become a really I kind of want to say entertaining, but an interesting battleground to watch kind of between these political factions over the next few years.
Yeah, I 100% agree. We constantly joke about how much we say this on the podcast, but Newton's third law of physics,
Yeah.
every action has an equal and opposite reaction, right? And I think that is exactly what's happening here is the left has been so dominant. And I do think that because of that essentially monopoly that they have had on political narratives over the last decade or two, that it's starting, like you were saying, the pendulum is starting to swing back in the other direction. However, I am concerned too that it's like when pendulums swing, they swing back with just as much momentum as they went over in the other place. And so like, this would be my message because, I am more sympathetic to say right-wing causes right now because I think the left has been allowed to run amok and they have caused a lot of issues like the mass migration policies, like the LGBTQ agenda and shoving it down everyone's throat and into education, all of this kind of stuff. But I think it's very important to remember, like one of my favorite philosophers said, Friedrich Nietzsche, when setting out to fight a monster, be careful that you do not become a monster yourself. And I think that is so important here because I do worry that the right wing will become just as emboldened as the left wing is currently as soon as it becomes extremely socially acceptable to hold those right wing policy or opinions. And I just sent you a video the other day where across Europe there's protests going on against the mass migration of Islamicists who want to subvert our democratic systems in order to elect pro-Islam leaders who will push through Sharia law in our systems. And I, as much as anybody, am very sympathetic to that idea that you do not want this. We do not want Sharia law ideas start finding their way into our policies. However, we talk about how the left is trying to subvert and ideologically control children. And in that video that I sent you, there was kids walking through the protests, joining in with chants with everyone else saying, Allah, who the fuck is Allah, right? And I'm looking at that and it just, dude, that upsets me just as much as seeing the LGBTQ stuff being forced on children, because I'm like, in no world does a kid on his own come to that rational conclusion. There's no way that they can even understand what is happening right now. So you know that is just those parents enforcing their political beliefs onto their kids. And despite the fact that I actually, yes, might be in line with those political beliefs right now, like my message to the right in that sense would just be like, leave the fucking kids out of it.
I don't think the kids are going to be as significant an issue. I think right now some people are weaponizing them in a sense, kind of like fighting fire with fire, which I don't agree with. However, when it comes to the right and the pendulum swinging, there's this cyclical nature to politics that kind of no matter what you do, the party in control over time just continues to do more radical shit to maintain power. And that's why right now being a conservative is like being a traditional liberal from the 90s. Because that's exactly kind of what you and I stand for. And that's exactly what the conservatives do these days. So it's kind of, it changes positions. And it is inevitable that if the right-wing groups across these governments across Europe, across North America, if they gain power in the way that the left did, because the left basically built a more westernized democratic agenda. It was a Western liberal agenda. That's kind of what was happening at scale across the world. If that same thing happens for the right wing, for the conservatives, you can bet, I will put all the money on it, that they will eventually become the problem the same way the liberals have. It's kind of the nature of politics and power. There's almost no way through it. And it's because the system itself is broken. However, for the next 5 to 10 years, they are probably exactly what the world needs. But it's kind of back to your point the other day you mentioned, like, I don't remember who said this exactly, and I'm going to butcher it a little bit, but democracy is a terrible system, but it's the best one we've got, right?
Winston Churchill.
Right.
Yeah. Democracy is the worst system. Democracy is the worst form of government except for all the others we've tried.
Right. So mine's a little more succinct. Don't really mind mine. Kind of like it actually. But yeah, my point is, it's like, no matter what you do and no matter what you say, you and I are insignificant. And even the most significant person in the world, it wouldn't matter if they said the same thing. This is the nature of macro politics. It's just what's going to happen. It's just right now, they're the right party to vote for. But this is why I tell people I'm politically agnostic. I'm not conservative. I'm not democratic. If anything, maybe libertarian. But it's because I believe you sort of have to choose based on the policies of the day. And you kind of have to navigate those waters given depending on what those parties are saying at that time, right? So it's, the positive thing with that though is I think that this generation is becoming a little more politically agnostic. I don't believe that. So, well, my mom's a liberal, so I'm a liberal. I think that's kind of dying out. And I think that that's really important because I actually believe that if democracy maintains any sort of decorum in the future, I don't know what that looks like, but let's say that it does. If that's the way it goes, then if people are willing to switch parties like they're willing to change their clothes, you give a lot less power to the macro institutions that are kind of running the country above them, right? So, I mean, bit of a silver lining, I suppose.
The rise of fascist parties throughout the 20th century in Italy, Spain, also Germany, they were seen as alternatives to the communists. So it was very much like they were in a battle between each other. It wasn't like the fascists were the only extremist parties that were going around at that time and everybody else was these fun-loving, peace democratic. It was like, no, it was two extremes battling it out for political power, right? And that's what I do worry that it could get back to that point. I think if there is a silver lining, it is that society is so sensitive to right-wing extremism now because everybody has that symbol of 1930s and 1940s Germany burned into their minds that anything resembling that sets off so many alarm bells.
Unless it's dressed up as liberalism.
And we've pointed out many times before that, yes, I think those alarm bells go off too soon, way too quick, way too many things get labeled alt-right, far-right, fascist,
it's just a weaponization term, yeah. It's less about substance and more about weaponizing it to slander somebody.
But I do think for that reason, it's far more likely that left-wing extremism will prevail because people don't have a good understanding of what left-wing extremism looks like. And yeah, when it comes to your point about being politically agnostic, I do think that more and more people are awakening to the reality that these slight differences that are put in front of our face a lot of the times between like, you know, vote left wing or right wing, vote for Democrat or Republican, whatever, that this is almost like false choices. They're two very similar candidates that differ slightly on unimportant topics. But then on the very important topics, like, yes, okay, you have a few wild cards like Trump and stuff.
I think today you got a few things that are a little wild. Yes, I agree. I think today is interesting that way. Yeah.
But I guess, yes, okay, so there is certain things
like
for
the
sure.
Gender stuff, like that's pretty significant. You know what I mean? But they're not on the same page there. The climate stuff, I don't really think they're on the same page there. Well, the conservatives, I think, are kind of wolf in sheep's clothing on that. I'd be careful with them.
But then also, I guess what I'm trying to point at is like when it comes to things like the military-industrial complex and they're very uniparty on that. It's like,
for sure.
It's like, argue about abortion.
Excessive
Argue about gender, all
yeah.
that. But hey, just as long as people aren't focused on how the Fed is printing money at a extremely unsustainable rate that is going to collapse the entire dollar, as long as people aren't arguing about whether we should be bombing people on the other side of the world for decades on end, as long as those things aren't in the public discussion, have at it. Debate about these cultural issues.
Well, what's actually impressive is the Democrats have convinced their followers that they need to be at war with the world.
Yes.
Which is really unique if you've been a Democrat for a long time and understanding what that party represents and why.
But hey, I mean, yeah, like I said, I am happy to see that more and more people are realizing that the solution isn't a specific political party, but rather a changing of perspective on our current government systems and not looking at it as like, okay, this one person is going to be our savior.
No, you know what's interesting actually, when you think about just, you talk about kind of government mismanagement and the amount of power they have and all that other stuff. And just, I was thinking about something the other day, and I was thinking about the number of days that politicians work in a year and then what our annual budget is. And basically, the federal government spends $2 billion a day that they're in office.
Oof.
That's insane.
That
is so fucking wild to run this country. Just to show you, that just shows you kind of how bloated and fat it is, right? And again, obviously they did summer off and weekends off, but still $2 billion a day when they're in office. The reason I say that is not only to say like, holy shit, what the fuck is happening here? But think of the power that group has and what they're willing to do to hang on to it.
Yeah.
We are such small pawns in this game, man. It's just crazy.
We are small pawns, but if the pawns work in coordination with one another, they can be like, and if you've got numerous amounts of them, they can be more powerful than say a single powerful piece like a queen or whatever,
sure,
right?
Yeah, life's like a bug's life. I totally get it.
Yeah, and so to me, I saw a meme the other day that was pretty funny, talking about memes, and it was like Tropic Thunder, and they were all in their stuff, and it was like me and the boys fighting back against a multi-billion-dollar propaganda machine with shit posting memes. It's like, it is true though. Like now memes hold just as much power, like internet shit, like what we do.
Yeah.
Is like, yes, I don't think you and I on our own are this massive thing that's at play here.
Objectively, we're not.
Yes. But
thanks for all the support.
But by us and other people and other people and other people fighting back against this centralized messaging system of like the CBC and stuff. I mean, it's at this point, alternative media and independent media is larger in Canada, I would say, than the CBC.
Totally agree with you. I totally agree. The challenge that we have is it's cat and mouse, right? We build independent media platforms. They shut down our media platform.
Yeah.
They stop us from being able to share news. So we lose an Instagram account. Then Instagram changes it so that they go, no more political content. So everybody has to opt in. They have all these ways. And TikTok is so egregious. They block half our shit.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? So you look at it and you're like, yes, we've got a voice. And we do have to fight back against them, but they've got so many weapons.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? And again, it doesn't mean we don't fight. It doesn't mean we don't push back. It's just, I guess, to sort of highlight maybe the battle that we have in front of us.
We're very much the guerrilla fighters going up against a massive, massive conventional army, right? So,
exactly.
All right, moving on to our next story of the day. We've got the NDP, Green Party, and a Trudeau-appointed senator pushing to change the voting age to 16. So they are pushing for Canadians to quote unquote accept the science and let 16-year-olds vote in federal elections.
What
Quote,
the fuck does that have to do with science?
Yeah.
Like, just say the data, the math. Give me something else. Don't say the science. Don't do it.
Yeah. The political science. Quote, we are welcoming world experts who have researched this for over a decade. The synopsis is clear. Nothing bad happens. Only good things for democracy in every country that has lowered the voting age to 16, McPhedran said at a news conference with the group in Ottawa on Wednesday. McPhedran credits the youth movement, Vote 16, for inspiring her to propose the bill. So, between attempts to lower the voting age, mass expansion of immigration policies, actively allowing hostile foreign governments to interfere in our democratic processes, as Sam Cooper just recently outlined in our latest episode, and proposed election reforms, is it safe to assume that the Trudeau government has no plans for a fair fight against Polievre and Conservatives in 2025?
Well, I guess the question you have to ask yourself is what's fair, right? If we're going to look at the science, just to highlight it, the data that they have shows you that people between 18 and 25, about 80% of them are going to vote anything but conservative. So the science says they're basically buying votes. But again, back to what's fair. Here's the reality we have to face. The sitting leader has two things that they can use to win elections that the opposition has an uphill battle against. One, of course, is policy. Like the above, it's blatantly obvious that these things are being done to buy votes. Last week, it was citizenship for all legal immigrants, which we figured could equal millions of votes, right? This week, it's lowering the age of voting to 16. So we already know the percentage is around 80% that are going to vote for anything but conservative. And then what they said was this would increase the voter pool by about 2 million people. So safe to say they just bought 1.6 million votes against the conservatives. That's pretty significant. The second thing, which is really combined with policy, is taxpayer dollars. This is the other thing that the sitting government gets to use against the opposition, right? So the sitting prime minister has access to obviously hundreds of billions of our taxpayer dollars to sway elections. And I know that they can't use them for the election, but they can use it to implement policy that will buy votes. And a great example of this would be universal basic income. Now, this will cost Canadians $120 billion a year to start if they're going to do this program, which is fucking insane. Do not vote for this. But yet, if Trudeau does implement it, he will buy millions of votes, right? So again, it's kind of what's fair. I mean, the opposition, on the other hand, has to win on policy promises. That's why when an incumbent loses, it's really on them. Because is it fair? Is it not? Well, that's the way the system's built, right?
And one thing that I want to point out right now is anybody, no matter what policy they're trying to put forward, no matter what changes they're trying to make, anyone who says that there is nothing bad that will happen and only good things will happen from their proposed changes, they're lying to you. Because, you know, as Thomas Sowell once said, there's no such things as solutions, only trade-offs. And I firmly believe that every single decision that gets made has both positive and negative consequences. And making good decisions means weighing positive consequences against negative ones and finding out where you actually lie. And this goes into, it's a philosophical concept of Chesterton's fence, where the whole idea is, imagine that somebody lives in a gated community and they grew up there. They've never lived anywhere else. And then one day they come across and they go, you know, I don't like that fence. We need to get rid of it. And then the elder of the community said, until you can come back to me and tell me why that fence should exist, I will not listen to you. And it's 100% correct. Until you can say that there might be a use for this thing, there might be a reason that we shouldn't allow 16-year-olds to vote, then, you know, I don't think that you're acting honestly, or at the very least, you're ideologically captured and or just trying to buy votes. And every single authoritarian regime in history has relied on radicalizing the youth and pushing forward political change through the youth. And so, like, even Maoist China did this. He got together with the Red Guards. And actually, it's funny because they sit here and say that they want the youth to hold the government accountable. There'll be more accountability, right? Well, that's exactly what fucking Mao did when he radicalized the Red Guards and started pushing them to try to tear down the old and undesirable aspects of the government that he wanted to push accountability for. And those fell into the four olds, which were old ideas, old culture, old habits, and old customs. And it's like, that's exactly what you see the youth going against right now as well. So like, to me, again, this does point to, I think these people are operating on the exact same ideology of Marxist tyrants of the past, and the youth are a fabulous weapon in that.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. I mean, I think it's pretty obvious when it boils down to this. Kids are going to school, education system's captured by the liberalism. It just is what it is. Social media, that's where kids live, captured by liberalism. Everything else is illegal on that platform. You just get blocked for it. And they already know about 75 to 80% of them are going to vote against conservatives anyway. They're just buying votes. It's just so fucking obvious. But again, is it fair? Kind of, it's hard to say, right? I guess that's where I get a little caught up. It's like, you're saying, is it a fair thing to do? I don't like it, but I guess based on our system, you could argue, well, they're not adults. We consider adults 18 and older, so that would say no. You're putting too much pressure on a young mind that doesn't have the faculties. You could make that argument, but if it's a policy that gets voted in by a liberal captured Senate and by a coalition government that's got a majority, is it fair? I don't know. I think that's where it gets a little sticky for me.
Yeah, I mean, if it's fair one way, it would be, you'd have to assume it's fair the other way. And then, so, I mean, you've heard, especially like Republicans down in the States will talk about how they want to up the voting age so that it's 25.
Right. Sure.
And it's like, okay, so if it's fair game for the liberals to try to pull down voters or the voting age to 16 so it benefits them, then it would be fair for the Republicans to do the same. And I think I'm along the lines where it's like, look, we have the age of adulthood at 18. And if that is what we consider an adult, then that is where these policies should lie.
Yeah, I mean, that's actually a really good point. You open up a can of worms that maybe you don't want to, because back to the old statistics, between 18 and 25, but once you get over 25, you start seeing people lean a lot more to conservative, especially over 30. So you bump that age up to 25, which theoretically the conservatives should have the right to do if the liberals do it, and that it being fair is fair. Then what happens? Because then the liberals are at a major disadvantage. So yeah, I mean, hey, if you do it today, then it can happen to you tomorrow. And like I said, I'm super cool with that. You either agree, hey, we're going to leave it at 18, or fair is fair.
All right, moving on to our next story. We've got Polievre promising to repeal all of Trudeau's egregious gun laws. So gun owners will catch a break when the Conservatives take office, according to Polievre. He has vowed to undo every law that Prime Minister Justin Trudeau has enacted against legal gun owners. Polievre discussed the strict vetting process legal gun owners undergo. Quote, "This is the least likely person to commit a crime with a gun. They've been vetted by the RCMP, undergone extensive training, and their firearms are known to the government because they have licenses," Polievre explained. Yet, Trudeau wants to take away their firearms. He pointed out that 99% of shipping containers entering Canada go uninspected, allowing weapons used in crimes to slip through. This lack of inspection also lets stolen cars go unnoticed at the Port of Montreal. Polievre promised to block illegal guns and reinstate mandatory prison sentences for gun smugglers and gang members who commit gun crimes. So, should Canadians be worried about Trudeau's attempt to disarm the population?
Again, this is policy promises, right? So this is what the Conservatives have to do. They have to make promises that they're going to fix the mess. That's what they get voted in. Canadians should be very concerned, right? We have a population that is growing at an unmanageable rate. Crime is seeing a significant rise, while penalties and enforcement are almost non-existent. And that's just the criminals. I'm not even worried about them. The government is our real problem. I mean, they were looking for any reason to pull the Emergencies Measures Act of the trucker convoy, which we learned from Sam just the other day. Which, let's be realistic, was a bunch of peaceful Canadians, not rampant wild criminals. And when they couldn't find one, they basically fabricated a reason to do it, right? They froze bank accounts and they went full authoritarian. They were even shredded on the global stage by several different governments around the world for this like very egregious act, right? So now you're seeing with CBDCs, digital IDs, stuff we touched on earlier, 15-minute cities. Yes, Canadians should be very concerned about the government attempting to disarm them. And it's funny, like I was writing about this the other day. As each day that goes by, my appreciation for an armed society continues to grow. I mean, guns may not be your thing, but allowing Canadians to have them is absolutely critical for the safety of our people.
In the 20th century, the Armenian genocide saw approximately 1.5 million Armenians killed after they were disarmed by the Ottoman Empire. During the Holocaust, Nazi Germany disarmed Jews and other persecuted groups, leading to the deaths of around 6 million Jews. The Rwandan genocide in 1994, where nearly 800,000 Tutsis and moderate Hutus were slaughtered, followed efforts to restrict their access to weapons. In Cambodia, the Khmer Rouge disarmed the population, resulting in the deaths of approximately 1.7 million people. Stalin's purges in the Soviet Union led to the execution and death of up to 1.2 million disarmed citizens, while tens of millions died in government-created famines and forced labor camps. The Nanking massacre saw around 300,000 Chinese civilians and soldiers killed by Japanese forces after being disarmed. Every single atrocity, mass atrocity in history, the precursor to that has been disarming the population.
The problem that we have here, and it's so ridiculous, and I actually don't think it's just here. I think it's a generational thing. It's more to do with time than location. We always think we can do it better. We always think there are better people in power, but history repeats itself. It's just wearing a different dress. So is that going to happen exactly that way in Canada? Probably not today, probably not tomorrow, but you're going to have a lot less options very quickly if you don't have the ability to defend yourself.
Yeah, and to that point, it's funny that the people who push mostly the notion that we're all the same and therefore diversity is our strength and we should all live together peacefully in unity. Well, if we're all the same, then you cannot make the claim that we're different than those people over there. You can't say that, yeah, sure, those governments killed millions of people after disarming everybody, but we as Canadians, we're different. It's like, well, wait, what are we? Are we the same or are we different? And I believe that in that regard, we are very much the same. And yeah, we should not be trusting our government to disarm us. All right, our next story for the day, we've got a study debunking the government claim that poverty is tied to systemic racism. The Trudeau government's race-based approach to fighting poverty has been misguided, according to a new study from the Aristotle Foundation. The study, titled Poverty and Race in Canada, Facts About Race Discrimination in the Poor, found that of the 1.6 million Canadians living in poverty, 58% are white or not a visible minority or Indigenous, when addressed based on low income after tax. When considering the cost of living, 2.5 million or 64% of those living in poverty are white. The study criticized programs like the Ontario's Racialized and Indigenous Supports for Entrepreneurs grant program, which allocates millions of dollars to support Indigenous, Black, and other racialized entrepreneurs. The study noted that such funding excludes 64% of low-income individuals who are non-minority and non-Indigenous. Matthew Lau, the study's lead author, argues that systemic racism is not the root cause of poverty in Canada. Instead, factors like having a high school diploma, a vehicle, working full-time, and having children after marriage play a more significant role. So, despite these findings, is it safe to assume that white Canadians will continue being demonized by Trudeau's administrators, politicians, and bureaucrats?
Yeah, I mean, they're just going to dismiss this and keep doing God's work. Right? That's exactly what's going to happen. The reason I say that is because this, again, is such a significant part of the Liberal platform. If you start going back on all this DEI crap and all the affirmative action stuff and everything they've done, how do you look? Right? Governments don't admit fault. So they're just going to brush this under the rug, or they're going to find some way to manipulate a study or discredit it in some way. That's my assumption. But I actually have an interesting story that for me, obviously I'm a white guy. And this is not a big deal. I don't really care, but this was like a few years ago. We were looking at applying for grants and opportunities for some business. I don't even remember what it was. But what I do remember is of the 60 or 70 grants that were for small business, for entrepreneurs, I could apply for 2 as a white guy. 2. I either had to be a female, BIPOC, Indigenous, something in that realm, which is interesting. So what you're actually seeing is you're seeing a lot of these corporations go, I know how to play the system. So they grab somebody on their board to join their corporation at a very small percentage so that they can then apply for all of these grants and all these subsidies and all these opportunities. Again, you're just gaming the system, but at the end of the day, it's okay. I don't care. I can make it on my own. But I just thought, why would you be doing that in that space? If you want to add additional ones, because there's always been tons of grants. If you want to add new grants specifically, I don't really agree with it, but okay, no problem. So that white guys or just anybody can still apply for 30 or 40 or 50 of them. Don't keep the same ones, add 5%, and then reduce the number that white people can apply to by 98%. What are you doing? How is that contributing to Canada? Like, look, entrepreneurs used to be the backbone of our economy. We used to depend on them. They were responsible for employing over 80% of Canadians. That number has dwindled significantly since the pandemic. It's almost like they have an agenda. But for me, like, it's hard enough to be an entrepreneur in this country. Everything about this country works against entrepreneurs, and then they do something like that. I just thought, like, Indians, like I said, this was a few years ago. I just thought, how ridiculous is this? So yeah, there's no way they're turning around on this. They're just going to discredit this and continue moving forward.
James Lindsay, he understands left-wing extremism, Marxism, better than anyone on this planet. And what he outlined in that speech at the UN, which I would highly suggest anybody going and watching.
Oh, that was about yesterday?
Yeah.
It was really good.
It's about 30 minutes long, but it's fantastic.
It was excellent. It was such a great explanation.
And so I'm going to give a very short breakdown of that, which is that Marxism has morphed because when it first was conceptualized, the idea is that any inequality between class groups, the bourgeoisie and the proletariat, aka the capitalists and the working class, any disparities between them is immediate evidence of oppression. And therefore, you need the government, the public sector, to seize the means of production, to seize economic control, and make sure that everybody is given equitable outcomes, right? To avoid, and that would be a fair and just society, free of oppression. Well, what the Marxists did is they realized that, and this was predominantly done through Antonio Gramsci in the Frankfurt Institute in Germany in the 1930s, I believe it was they said that the reason Marxism isn't taking control in the West is because they have a sort of cultural shield. They have strong cultural values of independence. And also from an economic front, the working class in the West doesn't feel very oppressed because back then, working in a factory was enough to get you a car, a house, and your wife didn't have to work.
We had a strong middle class,
right?
Yeah.
So the economic issue didn't grab hold here. So what they did is they started radicalizing along cultural lines, like gender, like sexuality, like race, all of this kind of stuff. And they said, well, any disparities between these lines is instant proof of oppression. In what James Lindsay points out is that a lot of these Marxist thinkers who very much have influenced academia. So for instance, the most cited academic of all time is Michael Foucault. So like these aren't just fringe academics. They are some of the most cited academics of all time. And so what he pointed out in that, and this wasn't a Foucault idea, but that whiteness is looked at as a form of property, right? It's a privilege. And so they need to redistribute economic power across cultural lines like race. And that's exactly what you see. Okay, we've got a government that is taxing everybody out the fucking ass right now to the point where most people can't even put food on their table or are at least struggling to have to penny pinch in order to. And then they take that money and they redistribute it, making sure that, you know, we don't strictly say that we're taking money from white people and then giving it to minorities. We take everybody's cash, but then we only redole it out back to people that aren't white.
Well, back to the grant program. Exactly. And it's annoying for me because what I find now, I'm a good example. So when I grew up, no one talked about race. I never thought about it. It was never really an issue. Sure, you have these pockets of bad issues, but it was never really part of any curriculum. It was never really, I just got along with everybody. I never even thought about it. Never, not once. It just didn't fucking matter. But now, it's forefront. It's a topic that everyone has to be discussing. And these groups are hard done by because of everything that white people have done. So now you're actually creating a more racist society. And you're creating this weird disparity between the two that like you said, was becoming sort of non-existent on its own over time. I'm sure there were factors at play. But now it's just only getting worse. And now all we think about is race. It's like, you're not solving the problem. You're only making it worse.
Yeah. I mean, we've even seen like there's over the last decade, the rates of people that are saying that they feel like there is racial tension is actually increasing. And then also even say on the LGBTQ front as well, you see the support for, say, gay marriage rapidly declining because, again, when you put these things in the forefront and you shove it down everyone's throat, of course, it is going to cause disruptions between people. And, I just put out a video yesterday talking about how ChatGPT said it would take over humanity. And one of those pieces is to make sure to promote tribalism and make sure that people on the ground level are fighting amongst each other rather than noticing that you have your thumb on them.
Right.
Both.
I mean, yeah, it's a very good point. I mean, you look at kind of what's happening in society, and if you just take the government action of what we talked about earlier in taking tax dollars from everybody and redistributing it to these minority groups only, which you'd see basically with those grants. Now, when you do that, what happens over time? I'm not like this, but at scale, what you'll see is people get upset because maybe there are a bunch of white people that depended on those grants that don't get them anymore. And when they start realizing what's happening to their tax dollars and it's just going to minorities, what do you think a significant portion of those people are going to feel towards the other groups? Sure, it may be misguided, but that's what you are creating. You are creating division. You are creating hate by doing these things. That's what that's the result of your actions. It's just, I don't know. They dress it up like some virtuous progressive strategy. It's terrible.
All right, our last story for the day. We've got Fauci admitting he did not follow the science and Big Pharma's secret payments to NIH over $700 million. So we'll take these one by one. First, Fauci admitting to baseless pandemic measures. In recent testimony, Dr. Anthony Fauci admitted that the widely implemented 6-foot social distancing rule was not based on scientific evidence, but, quote, just sort of happened. Fauci also admitted he couldn't specifically recall any evidence supporting the practice of masking children, stating, quote, I might have, but I don't recall specifically that I did. In his defense, he later said, quote, there was no study that did masks on kids. You couldn't do the study. You had to respond to an epidemic that was killing 4,000 to 5,000 Americans a day. Despite his claim, there are numerous studies indicating negative impacts on children, including a National Institutes of Health study reporting, quote, very negative effects on students' literacy and learning, and another NIH study linking social distancing to depression, anxiety, and stress. Regarding the lab leak theory, Fauci acknowledged it is a, quote, possibility, contrasting with his earlier dismissal of the hypothesis. So, Fauci seemingly lying about everything that he pushed forward over the last couple of years.
It's really the money is moving the needle, right? So we all know that there's a lot of money changing hands in the political world, right? Be it bribery, corruption, or extortion. It's clear that our politicians, regulatory agencies, and crown corporations prioritize power and profit over the people. This is what they've been doing for centuries. It's what we know they're going to continue to do. Now, most of this happens behind the scenes, and while it's totally unacceptable, most of us remain relatively unaffected. It doesn't matter if you pay this guy, if this road company pays the government and that guy gets a $200 million contract. Sure, it's not good use of our tax dollars all the time, but we're going to drive on the road anyway. It's relatively insignificant, right? However, when it comes to the health and medical sector, when billions of dollars are involved in fast-tracking approvals, overlooking critical reports, omitting data, turning a blind eye, or even blatantly lying like this guy has, many innocent people suffer severe harm or worse, they die, right? So the fact that this kind of money is openly circulating, this isn't like they say secretly, but these payments are reported, a lot of them. We know $700 million went to the NIH in 22 and 23. In the 12 years before that, it was $325 million. So you talk about motivation behind the pandemic, it's so obvious, right? So like I said, when this kind of money is openly circulating in the industry, it is such a glaring indicator that it is completely compromised and that none of these people can be trusted, let alone just Fauci, who's the guy that seems to be taking the fall at this point.
You can now not even give these people the benefit of the doubt that they were just wrong. But the more we learn, it actually looks like they were extremely malicious and doing all of this for their own personal gain. And especially when you look at how this shit played out with the kids above all, like, man, those videos watching kids like screaming and crying to get masks off of their faces in classrooms and teachers like forcing the masks onto kids. And then also you look at, yes, how it has negatively affected them from a social aspect of being able to read people's faces, picking up on vocal cues. All of that is extremely important. And what I don't think people give enough credit to as well is like this idea that you'll develop that later. That's not a thing. There is critical points throughout a child's development in where they need to develop those certain skills and habits and language and such. And if they don't, it is like a genuine mountain of issues to try to overcome in order to correct those issues later in life. And I think we haven't even seen the full consequences of those policies yet.
No, I mean, I'm very much inclined to agree with you. And you know, something interesting that popped up just to highlight how dangerous these global governing bodies are, like the WHO. I think it's pretty clear that what they sold us in terms of what these mRNA vaccines were, what they sold us was a lie. I'm not going to say whether you should or shouldn't get it, do your thing. But what they said was a complete lie, right? And now just the other day, just yesterday, Teddy G from the WHO came out and said, we need to take a more harsh stance and a different approach to these anti-vaxxers. We need to do more to stop these people. We should not be tolerating these people. He goes, these things are safe and they make a difference. Okay. Well, do you realize that COVID is what created a lot of vaccine skepticism? I was not vaccine skeptic until COVID. I got mine as a child. My wife was a little on the fence for sure. I was like, yeah, whatever. Now that I have done a ton of research, holy hell. Everyone should do their own, and I think everyone should look into it on their own time. They don't seem all that safe to me, especially these ones. But now what's interesting though is you have Fauci, who was the face of COVID. He was the guy. He was the Western face of COVID. Now saying, I did not follow the science. I don't even know where this shit came from, right? But now you got Teddy over here in the corner for the WHO, who's trying to get the entire world to sign on to the pandemic treaty to give them globally governing power to tell you what to do and when you have to take this or that. He's over there saying, you guys, now we need to come back in with power and force against people that are now vaccine skeptic. You're kind of going, what the hell is happening here? You know, we know they sold us a lie and now they're admitting as much, except this guy over on this side is basically saying, we're going to continue doing this and now we need more power to basically force it down your throats. What the fuck?
And look at the consequences of that as well. Dude, I remember going for a run in the early days of the pandemic. And I came up on a sidewalk to a stoplights, and there was somebody biking the same direction. And so they were on the shoulder of the road. I was on the sidewalk. I had my headphones in. I was just kind of bobbing along, doing my own thing. And I just noticed, I couldn't even hear her, but this Karen fucking sitting on a bike is beaking me about supposedly being within 6 feet of her. And so like I take my headphone and was like, what? Sorry. And she's like, can you give me some space? Have you been watching the news? And I was just like, okay. If I laid down right now, would I touch you? And she was like, no. And I was like, okay, well, I'm 6'1". Have a great day. And because 100%, I was like far enough away. Yeah. But like, look, that whole policy was made up. As Fauci is admitting, there was no scientific basis for that.
Outside.
And what did it cause? It caused citizens to essentially go to war with one another, making sure, stay the fuck away from me, this and that. What does that do to society? Well, it turns people into enemies of one another.
Well, it looks like we're leaving people on a very negative note today.
All right. So don't forget to head over to our website to sign up for our newsletter, which goes out 6 days a week. That's blendrnews.com, BLENDR news.com. And we'll catch you next time.
Bye, everybody.